Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. And welcome back to my lecture series, What It Means to be a Lutheran. We're now on to our final Lutheran confession, the Formula of Concord. And we're going to begin then with a historical introduction. So basically, after the death of Luther, Lutheranism gets divided into three main groups. There's the Philippists, or the Melanchthonians, who follow Philip Melanchthon, the Gnatio, or genuine Lutherans, who were often more overcorrecting. They are kind of more like solid Lutherans, but they tended to overcorrect a lot more. And then there's also the majority of Lutherans considered the Concordists. They're the middle Lutherans. So the controversies of Lutheranism can really be divided up into six main controversies. And the earliest one is the antinomian controversy, and this goes back to the late 1520s, when Luther's student Johann Agricola challenged Philip Melanchthon because of Melanchthon's views of the necessities of God's law. A decade later, Agricola would even go on to challenge Luther himself, leading to the antinomian controversy, which Luther addressed in the 1538 version of the Small Coelc-Articles. You also have the theologian Nicholas Armsdorf, who would also fall into this antinomian error. Luther condemns the antinomians for essentially teaching a once forgiven, always forgiven kind of doctrine, because the idea was that once you were converted and forgiven by Jesus, you didn't have to amend your life or continually repent or continually receive absolution because you were already forgiven. The later Gnatio Lutherans, influenced by the leadership of Nicholas Armsdorf, would again fall into these kind of errors. The next error that would lead to the official break between the Philippist and the Gnatio Lutherans was the intrimistic controversy, also known as the aphoristic controversy. Now, to explain this rather quickly, there was the Small Coelc, the first Small Coelc War from 1545 to 47 between the Small Coelc League of Lutheran princes and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Now, the Lutherans lost mostly because of the betrayal of the Lutheran Duke of Ducal Saxony, Moritz, who sided with the emperor, hoping to get control of Electoral Saxony, ruled then by Prince John Frederick, the son of John the Steadfast, the nephew of Frederick the Wise, who'd protected Luther. Following the defeat, the emperor imposed on the Lutherans the Augsburg Interim, suppressing their teachings and forcing them to submit to the Pope. Now, the interim did make some concessions, allowing priests to marry and the laity to have communion under both kinds, and also that the Lutherans could submit not to the Lutheran Reformation, but to the Reformation done by Erasmus. So they could kind of adopt some reforms of Catholicism. Now, of course, the Lutherans objected to this, and Moritz, who was still devoutly a Lutheran, sought a new compromise and commissioned Melanchthon to write a new document which would be known as the Leipzig Imperm. Now, due to conflicts between Moritz and the emperor, there was an outbreak of a second Small Coelc War, which the Lutherans won and led to the Peace of Augsburg, and so the Leipzig Imperm was never actually adopted. However, it contained many issues. The first one being that Melanchthon sought to compromise with the Roman Catholics on the grounds of adiaphora. And the Gnatio Lutherans insisted that in Christian freedom, the Lutherans should not be forced to adopt these Roman practices. The other issue that came out of this Leipzig Imperm was the majoristic controversy, also considered the good works controversy. See, George Mayer had defended the Leipzig Imperm statement that good works are necessary for salvation. Yes, Luther and Melanchthon had rejected antinomianism, and they held that good works were necessary. In the Small Coelc Articles, Luther said that faith without works is not true faith, and in Article 6 of the Augsburg Confession, Melanchthon confessed that our churches, that is the Lutheran churches, teach that faith should yield good fruits and that a person must do good works. In this way, one could confess with the Epistle of St. James that we are not justified by faith alone, but faith and works. That works are a fruit of faith. However, Major took this too far by saying that works contributed to salvation rather than just an outgrowth of salvation. This controversy really led to the split between the two groups. The Philippists taking up root in Electoral Saxony in Wittenberg and Leipzig, and the Gnasio-Lutherans earning the title Magdeburgers because they took up root in Magdeburg in Ducal Saxony. The Concordists would really take up their headquarters in Wartenberg in Swabia. Now, the next controversy is one actually that both groups rejected, and that's the Osiandrian controversy. Can also consider the Theosis controversy. For Andreas Osiander, a close colleague of Luther, had been influenced by the mystic Jewish doctrines of Kabbalah, which seek a divine relationship between God and man. While it is true that Lutherans believe in a mystical union, that the Christ and the Christian are one, we teach that we are justified when God declares us righteous by faith, when we receive God's grace, whereas Osiander taught that we are justified through this divine mystical union with Christ. The next controversy is actually a positive in the fact that this would lead to a split in the Philippists and help bring about unification of the two groups. This was the Crypto-Calvinist controversy. See, towards the end of his life, Philip Melanchthon started making compromises with Calvin, particularly on the issues of the two natures and the real presence. For Calvin was a Nestorian in regard to his views on the two natures, and he held this spiritual view on the Lord's Supper, considered to be a subtle sacramentarianism. See, sacramentarianism, like Zwingli and Karlstadt, just deny the real presence. But guys like Martin Bucer and John Calvin, they did teach that you receive the real presence of Christ's body and blood through Holy Communion, but they rejected the idea that the bread was his body or that the wine was his blood. The Lutherans considered this to be subtle sacramentarianism, and when it was revealed that the Philippists in Electoral Saxony had been promoting this view, this would lead to them being kicked out. The final controversy amongst the early Lutherans was also the synergistic controversy, and this would also bring into the Flacian controversy, which is like its own controversy but is somewhat part of the synergistic controversy. Essentially, the Philippists were teaching that the human will contributed something to salvation. Matthias Flacius Aristarchus, known as Flacius, he overcorrected, teaching that the human will was completely bound, that the human substance was original sin, and he fell into the Manichaean error that basically the human flesh is evil. So he was an overreaction. And what is interesting is that how these different errors emerge. With the Philippists, their errors emerged because they were seeking compromise, either with Rome or Calvin, a kind of ecumenicism, that they were compromising the doctrines of Lutheranism. Whereas the Gnasio-Lutherans, their errors stemmed from throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They were overreacting. So the Philippists, like modern liberal Lutherans, they compromised the truth of Lutheranism for, trying to make unity with the world or with other denominations. And the Gnasio-Lutherans, like some real strict synods today, they overreact and overcorrect, and they too fall into error. Whereas we Lutherans, like what we here in the coelc try to do, is seek the middle way. A good example is the whole objective justification debate, in which some groups, like the Wells and that, hold to a more Huberian view of objective justification, which was rejected by the early Lutherans. But then groups like Aldona, in their rejection of this Huberian view, overreact and just disregard objective justification altogether. And so they have one side teaching one error and the other side overreacting to the other error, whereas we in the coelc try to follow the teachings of Gerhard in regards to justification and seek the middle way, avoiding the two errors. And that is what the Concordist Lutherans strove to do. Not to compromise, but to also avoid overreacting against either side. And so, how then did reunification come about? Well, the first attempts were made back in 1556 when Melanchthon and Flacius attempted reunification. Flacius, though, was very stubborn and refused to compromise with Melanchthon. He wrote a letter to Melanchthon with his conditions of peace, but got no reply. He later also wrote his 13 lenient propositions to Melanchthon, but also got no reply. This led him to write his own pamphlet concerning unity, defending his positions. However, someone like Johannes Brenz, another colleague of Luther Melanchthon, he strove for this middle position. In his death of 1517, he would die and his work would be succeeded by Johannes Andrea. Johannes or Jacob Andrea. In 1567, Andrea wrote his, and there's a rather lengthy document, or a lengthy title, Confession and Brief Explanation of Several Converted Articles according to which a Christian unity might be effected in the churches adhering to the Augsburg Confession, which was shortened to the 5 Articles. These articles attempted unity, however, this document alienated Andrea from the Philippists and pushed him closer to the Gnacio Lutherans. As I said, the Gnacio Lutherans did overcorrect. They weren't perfect, but they were more like the more correct ones. It's kind of like how in the days of Jesus, the Sadducees were really wrong, and the Pharisees, while not perfect, were more theologically accurate and in line with Christianity. Meaning that after the resurrection of Jesus, when Jews did start to convert to Christianity, a lot of that happened from amongst the Pharisees and not so much amongst the Sadducees. In 69, Duke Christopher Württemberg organized 3 theologians, Andrea, Martin Chemnitz, and a Philippist, Nicholas Selnecker, to work together to try and find compromise and unity. Also in 69, Andrea and Chemnitz prepared the church order for the Duchy of Brunswick, and in it they contained a series of confessional statements regarding these recent controversies. In 73, Andrea wrote his 6 sermons on the disputes dividing the theologians of the Augsburg Confession, in which he called on then churches to unite around these statements. Martin Chemnitz and David Chytraeus were then asked for their input. They requested a formal theological statement, prompting Andrea to write the Swabian Concord of 74, and Chemnitz and Chytraeus would help amend this, releasing the Saxon Swabian Concord of 1575. Meanwhile, Count Ernst Henberg, Margrave Karl of Baden, and Duke Louis of Württemberg would organize a committee at Maulbronn to formulate a document known as the Maulbronn Formula. This would establish 2 very important rules. One, that the rule and norm of the Lutheran faith is the Holy Scriptures, however guided by the Augsburg Confession, the Apology, the Small Court Articles, and the Catechisms. And also the Maulbronn Formula made the rule that for the sake of unity, we would address the errors but not name the errorists. So when we address the Osiandrian controversy or the Flacian controversy, we just talk about the errors, but we don't say, hey, Flacius taught this. Also in 74, because of the crypto-Calvinist controversy, Elector August of Saxony kicked out a bunch of crypto-Calvinists for spiritualizing the sacraments. He then got Andrea and Salnecker to come and try and restore the Lutheran doctrine, the real presence within electoral Saxony. Then there would be a new committee formed of 4 theologians, Andrea, Chemnitz, Salnecker, and Chytraeus, along with 2 representatives from Brandenburg, Andrew Muculus and Christopher Corner. And these men would write a document at Torgau known as the Torgau Book, which was made up of the Saxon-Swabian Concord and the Maulborn Formula, with some influence also from Andrea's 6 sermons. This Torgau Book of 76 would be circulated amongst all the Lutheran clergy for their input, and after they had gotten this input, they made a revised version in 77 known as the Bergen Book. This Bergen Book is what we today call the Solid Declaration of the Formula of Concord. Because it was a rather lengthy document, Andrea then made a shortened version known as the Epitome. 2/3 of Lutheran clergy in Germany would accept this, and on June 25th, 1580, Elector Ludwig of the Palatine, Emperor August of Saxony, Elector Joachim II of Brandenburg, and 8,188 Lutheran pastors would accept the Formula of Concord and the Book of Concord, published on the 50th anniversary of the presentation of the Augsburg Confession. And that then is our history of the Formula of Concord. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.